I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Reading Museum, and we are interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC opening its first offices in the United Kingdom. It's January the 9th, 2024, and we are at the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley. I'm here today talking to Anthony Holmes. Anthony, please, let's start with the basics. If you could give us your full name and your place and year of birth.
So, I'm Anthony John Holmes, known as Tony. Born in Northamptonshire, spent time travelling around, lived in Wiltshire and Berkshire. I have 2 sisters and 1 brother. And my education is, I went to Compton Secondary Model School and decided I wasn't going to go on to do, and this is when they did CSEs as opposed to GCSEs. I went from there to the Royal Naval Stores Depot down near Corsham in Wiltshire, where I joined the Technician Apprentice Training Centre and did a 4-year apprenticeship there, which gave me basically my grounding in electronics.
Okay. And what was your parents, what do they do? Do they have a background in any of this?
Yes, so my father was a scientist. He worked at Rutherford Appleton Laboratories. He also worked at one point, we lived down in Dorset, and he worked at the nuclear base down there, submarine base down there. He also worked for some time in Geneva, in CERN. And my mother was mainly a housewife. So in those days it wasn't so much a career for her with her background, but she was actually born in what was Peking, now Beijing, and didn't actually go to school till she was 11 years old, because this was during time when she was interned and stuff like that. My father, when he was working in Northamptonshire, he would cycle 12 miles one way to go to work, come home, and then cycle 12 miles the other way to go to college daily. So he was driven. And
so how would you categorise your kind of, I suppose, your school career? You sound like you were kind of ready to, it wasn't really you weren't that fascinated by it, you were ready to go on to more practical things?
Yeah, so I did, as I say, I did a CSE. It would have been changing schools to do the A-levels, and that would have been interesting, starting from CSE rather than going from GCSE. But I was also a very practical kind of person. It wasn't that I didn't want education, I just didn't see the pure academic side as being particularly for me. And I looked around for an apprenticeship, and I found one at Rutherford, which I didn't join, but I found one down in the Royal Naval Stores Depot, which I went to for 4 years. That was from age 16. And as I say, I think that gave me a great background, because it was a practical course, mechanical, electrical and electronic. And college was at Bath College. So we would do, 6 weeks here and 6 weeks there, or whatever. At the end of that, I did quite well in the course, and I was encouraged to go to university, which I then didn't stick to, coming back to the principle that academia wasn't really my forte, shall we say. But I did have this apprenticeship behind me, and from there, what did I do? I took a year out to teach hang gliding. So went away from electronics altogether, came back into electronics via a satellite tracking station, where I was monitoring satellite paths and making sure they sent signals when they were supposed to, etc. And then applied to digital equipment for a job.
So how did you go from hang gliding back into satellite tracking? What was the role you did in satellite tracking, and why did you decide like hang gliding was the thing? Was it just something you just wanted to?
Well, I decided on hang gliding because whilst I was doing my apprenticeship, I took up hang gliding as a sport. I enjoyed it greatly. As I say, I went off to university, decided I didn't like that particularly. At that point, I decided to go and join my hang gliding instructor as a trainee and then become an instructor. So I was teaching hang gliding. I was also teaching kayaking in the evenings at the same period. After a year of that, I decided that it was not going to be a good career in the long term. So I looked around for a job, and I found a position in a satellite tracking station. I knew nothing about satellite tracking or what was needed, but it was a job, and it was in the electronics background, if you like. And it was to help ensure that the satellites were doing what they were meant to do. It's a long time ago, so I can't remember the details, but basically it was monitoring that they were delivering signals when they should do. But I realised quite early on that wasn't going to be a career move either. It was a way in. It was better to go for a more electronic job from an electronic job than from hang gliding. So I stayed there, I don't know, 3-6 months or something, but I saw this advert from Digital Equipment and decided that I would apply for that. This was for the group in Reading called Computer Special Systems.
Right.
So I got a job there.
What was the job you saw first?
It was a technician, basically.
Right.
And what we were doing, so background on Computer Special Systems, CSS, is that they developed, if you like, add-on products. They weren't supposed to be a profit centre in their own right. They were there to help sell computers. Okay, so we would be developing and building and testing. My role at that time was testing. Was devices like communications devices or whatever was needed that would be a value add to a computer system from DEC.
So tell me about, where did you see the job ad? It's in a newspaper, and what was the interview process?
I think it was a newspaper. I can't think how else, because in those days internet wasn't quite there. Job interview process was interesting. It was the middle of January. I lived in Newbury at the time. The satellite tracking station was in Winkfield Row, if you know where that is. Well, it's east of Reading, southeast of Reading, actually near Bracknell. I woke up to find a lot of snow. So I thought, that's interesting. So anyway, I got in the car, I drove to the satellite tracking station, got there about on time, knocked on the door and said, I'm here for interview. And they said, oh, well, your interviewer hasn't shown up because of the weather. Where have you come from? Well, I've come from Newbury. Where's your interviewer? A mile down the road. He showed up and I got the job.
Okay. And what was the interview like? Was it rigorous? What are you?
I don't think it was particularly rigorous. I mean, it was checking my electronic skills, and also, that I would be able to cope with electronic equipment, turning things on and off, or controlling, if you like, array angles, whatever was needed to make sure the satellite tracking occurred. But the interview itself, I don't think was particularly onerous.
So this is for DEC. This is for the DEC interview.
No, that was for satellite tracking.
So where the interview for DEC?
For DEC, that was just goodness me. That was I don't know, about an hour, if I remember correctly. But it basically just touched on what I knew about electronics and electronic design and testing. So, given my background was in electrical and electronic engineering, where we had developed things and tested things, and we'd been involved in testing sonar and radar systems, for example, in Coalport for the submarine base up in Scotland, down in Portland area, and places like that. So we got to go to various different places during the course of our apprenticeship. So a lot of that was, of course, being that kind of equipment, it was very much follow a script in terms of doing the testing, making sure that you could do everything and follow the script to make sure that the system was doing what it was meant to do.
Did you? So you see, your job ad for DEC was where? That was a newspaper as well.
Yes, I think so.
And you were looking to move on by this point.
I was looking to move on, and I saw it and I applied.
What did you know about DEC at this point?
Oh, I knew it was up and coming may not be the right word, but I mean, I knew it was a computer company. And I had done some looking up to see what kind of things it was doing, especially when I found out about the Computer Special Systems group. I thought, well, that sounds interesting because it's not just computing, it's in support of computing. So I thought, I'll give that one a go. So that's how I got into Computer Special Systems. That was in Arkwright Road in Reading.
So you were aware of the company, you'd done some research. Was there anything about the company that stood out about its, I don't know, the name, the reputation, the culture, any of those attributes coming across at this point?
Well, I knew nobody who worked there, but I was aware that it was, there was IBM, and then there was DEC, as far as I could tell. There were others, but the two that stuck in my mind were IBM and DEC, and that there were no opportunities in IBM, and I found one in DEC. So I went to DEC.
And it sounds like you didn't have any experience of DEC systems before this.
No.
Okay. So describe the role. So you go to Arkwright Road to CSS. What's your impression? What's it look like? Describe what you see there.
Well, it's one of those, a small building in a run of industrial buildings, but it's set up with labs and test benches and things for the area that I was going to be working in. And it just was interesting because of the kinds of things they were doing. The premises weren't brilliant, but that didn't matter. It was an interesting place to work.
Why wasn't it brilliant?
It was a bit tatty, if you like. I mean, DEC was quite young in the country at the time. Well, I suppose it wasn't that young, but anyway, it was just one of its offices. DEC at that time didn't have any big premises in Reading. So there was Arkwright Road, which was just described a bit like a sort of a industrial brick buildings. And I worked there. I can't remember how long I worked there for, actually. Actually went looking for my resume the other day to find out, but of course I've lost it somewhere. Computer systems somewhere. But anyway, I worked there for a while, and then an opportunity arose for the Network and Communications group.
Just before we get to that, just describe, so you're in there, and how old are you at this point in CSS? What's your age?
Let's see, I joined in, must have been 79, 80. So I was about 23.
Okay. And is it a busy, because none of us have seen this, we can't see the inside of it, so what is it, a busy environment, lots of engineers, like a workshop, more workshop than a lab? It sounds like it's more of a garage than a lab.
It was more of a, I would have called it a lab in that it had rows of benches with power supplies and oscilloscopes and meters and power outlets and test rigs, if you like, and i.e. computers into which you would plug a card to see if it was doing what it's supposed to do and then debug why it didn't. And that's the role I had mainly, was debugging why something didn't do what it's supposed to do.
And are you actually physically building equipment in CSS, or is it more of a coding job in CSS?
It's physical cards that were designed and built. Where was the manufacturing actually done? That's a good question. Can't think. I think it was done actually in Arkwright Road, but don't hold me to that. And
do you remember anything, any particular, your first job, were you just let loose? Were you under supervision there?
Well, I had a manager, and he just directed me to look after this particular kind of product. I was young then, fresh out of an apprenticeship and then time off, effectively. So, but anyway, I joined that group, and it was interesting because I did uncover some design flaws in the equipment that they designed, and I was left to get on with that. Right, you go debug what's wrong with this, and they just leave me to it.
And do you remember any particular jobs that stand out, or systems that you worked on there?
Not in CSS, no.
And what was the pace of work like? What was a typical day, and how would the work come to you at CSS? There would just be an allocation, I guess, of, this card isn't doing what it's supposed, this product isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Take a look at it, get the spec, get the card, get the test rig or whatever it was going to go into, and then debug what was going wrong. And was it, what's the kind of, what your colleagues like? Is it kind of a very male environment? Is it a mixed environment? What's the kind of age like in CSS?
It was quite young. It was probably 100% male at the time. And it wasn't a very big group. There was only a few people there. So,
how many people? Because I get the impression is it's quite a large group, but it sounds like it's quite small.
well, the group I was with was small. I can't remember the rest of it. It was a relatively small testing group, really.
And so I've heard said that CSS had its own kind of culture. It was kind of about compared to the rest of DEC in Reading.
That is probably true, but bear in mind that was my first job in DEC. In terms of culture, the network and communications group, which I went to, that was definitely an interesting culture because that behaviour was sort of more like a startup type of organisation in the network and communications.
Okay. Well, at this point, so you're fairly young. You're in the CSS group, and just kind of interested because you were based in Reading, because Arkwright Road is in Reading.
Yep.
What was, and this is before DEC Park is created.
Yes.
Did you meet many other people from DEC at this point? Was there much interplay? So you're pretty much just...
we were completely isolated, if you like, autonomous group. Didn't know anything about much of the rest of DEC, to be honest. Learnt more in the next job.
Okay. And what was you're in DEC, because you were commuting into Reading, I think, weren't you, at this point? Or were you based
I
in
was
Reading?
living in Reading, in Newbury, so
okay.
it wasn't far.
And what's Reading like at this point? Describe, because we're dealing with people who live and work in Reading, so what is Reading like at this point? Is there much of a DEC presence in Reading to your eye?
Not to my eye at that time. Although having said that, we had I wonder when that started. They opened an office down in the middle of town, quite close to the station. And that was interesting. I have 3 children, and they had a club called DEC Ducks, where they would go swimming every Saturday morning in the swimming pool underneath the DEC office in the middle of Reading. DEC also opened an office at the Shire Hall at one point as well, which I didn't work at. Didn't work at the one in the centre of Reading either. But those were the presences that happened. But in terms of timelines, I'd have to think about the timelines. Because we started off married life in Reading, moved to Newbury, Donington, then up to Scotland and then back. So you had the 3 children. You were in Reading at the time. Yes.
And the DEC Ducks is interesting. So they had like a group. Was that for a week, for weekend, for activities? Was that?
It was a weekend swimming session, and the kids who went to it were called DEC Ducks.
Did DEC do much for families?
Yes, I think so.
What kind of things did they do?
I'm trying to think what they did, but that was one of them. They had various events, but we're going back. Started in 1979 or whatever it was. It's a long time ago.
Just kind of get a sense of how usual this was for corporations to do this kind of thing for their employees at this point.
Well, I can't say how usual or unusual because I didn't work for anyone else to compare it with, and I didn't really talk to people about that kind of stuff. All I knew was, from my perspective, I thought DEC did a good job in terms of involving families and being interested in what families were doing and providing facilities to help with that, such as the swimming.
Were they doing much for parents, like kind of women getting into work, from your perception, or anything else that they were doing in terms of supporting families?
There were certainly, later on, not in CSS, but there were definitely women joining the organisation and working inside DEC, yes. Okay.
So let's move on a bit. So you've been at CSS for a number of years now. So what happens next?
I think CSS was actually less than a year.
Okay.
But then I discovered they were opening a new group called the Network and Communications Group. And I went to see them, see what was going on, what it was all about, and managed to get a job there as a development engineer at the time. So again, it wasn't a design engineer then, it was a development engineer. And I moved to Acre Road with that role initially because that's where they set up. So it was in some strange looking warehouse building with massive great trunking, 4 feet, 5 feet across, trunking running around ceilings and all sorts of stuff. So it was an interesting environment. But that was interesting because that was a lab of, there was the designers, I could mention names, but there was the designers, and then hardware and software. And the software team was actually quite big. The hardware team was quite small. And then there was, again, the work I did, which was development, which really meant testing, building and testing products. As part of that, that was in Acre Road before we moved to DEC Park. So,
what attracted you to the position? Because you were previously quite happy with where you were, or you were kind of getting itchy, ready to move on?
Well, I thought there were some interesting comments in CSS, and I looked at it and thought, well, there's a little bit of a limited scope. And then this network and communications group started up, and I thought, well, there's a new group starting up. They're doing something different. It's not computers, and it's not necessarily things to be a non-profit, if you like. It wasn't an enabler. What we were developing in the network and communications group was going to be a product line in its own right, and bringing communications into DEC because they didn't have a communications, if you like, strategy, I don't think, at the time. So I moved to this group to help develop these initially asynchronous communication servers, multi-channel.
So this is what era, 80s at this point getting into, 80s, 90s?
Yes. Yes, because I went to Scotland in 88 and back in 90, so yes. So that was the initial time I spent doing those kinds of networking communications devices in the early-ish mid-80s. I'd probably have to go and look it up to see the dates, but I can find it.
The Scotland came before that, by the sounds of it?
No, Scotland came after that, but then I went back to that same group.
Right, okay.
So I was there twice.
So networking was becoming a big factor for DEC, wasn't it, by this point?
Yes, it was, and the central engineering group decided, with help from Europe, that they could do with some expertise in Europe, developing products that would better match the European market. So Network and Communications Group was opened up in Reading, first in Acre Road and then moving to DEC Park. And the first product from that group opening up was called a DHV11. This was an 8-port asynchronous communications device, so a device that communicated over RS-232 or 432, 422, whatever, to terminals and things, allowing access to control systems into computers, such as a PDP-11 with a QBus.
I suppose the question is briefly is why did DEC have this sudden appreciation that it couldn't just bring over networking product? What was special about networking products? They had to be built here in the UK rather than coming over from or designed and built in the US.
Yes, so the products in the US were sort of US centric, US standards, if you like. Europe had its own standards for how devices were going to communicate. And we already had a software group in the UK developing things like X25, which was European-centric at the time. So that drove the decision to build a group to create European-centric products.
Okay. So, and you mentioned the product that you started with there, which was the DHV11, I think?
Yeah, started with the DHV11, went on to a DHU11, which was a 16-line instead of 8-line device, and then moved into servers.
And what was special about those particular products? How were they, and what role did they serve?
So again, the DHV and DHU11 were used to connect computer systems such as PDP-11s to let's say, manufacturing control systems to terminals like the VT100 or other terminals that allowed users to interact with the computer system and to communicate over longer distances as well by feeding those channels into other devices like modems and communicating over longer, wider distance.
And what was the I suppose the culture like at the networking and communications group? It's very much of an engineering sort of mindset. Where are the ideas coming for the products, and what's the kind of structure like there?
So the network and communications group, the ideas, I mean, we just felt that, or the group thought that Europe needed these European-centric communication devices, and grew up over a period of time. And the first one was, as I said, this 8-channel or 8-port communications device, which was going to satisfy a certain need, and it grew from there really.
And then you said then it moved on to a communication server, I think, wasn't it?
Yes. So the idea then was to go into more high-performance communication servers to operate over the wider area. So long-haul, if you like, communications, connecting computers. So these servers would connect a local area network, Ethernet, for example, to the wider area networks using, for example, X75 protocols or and other protocols and formats like SDLC and HDLC. But they would then go into basically the telephone system network and communicate over longer distances.
And this is an important time. I think networking was becoming a wide area networking was becoming a big issue at this point in the UK.
Wide area networking was very important because it was a mechanism by which banking systems and trading systems could communicate with each other, and for that you needed a wide area connection because they're all over the world, and they have to be very reliable.
And what would you were kind of building something, because you went on to create, it had a kind of very much, I think, described as a skunk works kind of feel to it, this group. I described that.
Well, so the group in Reading had proposed a product idea, which wasn't sort of taken up by management in the US. But the management in DEC and Reading decided that we were going to go away and try and do something about this anyway, make a prototyping system to demonstrate what we were actually talking about. So despite it not being, let's say, properly funded, it did get developed, and I was a part of that team.
And what was the product?
So that was the prototype, if you like, was just a single channel server to behave as an external server to a computer system. That would allow a wide area connection. So a product that came out of the advanced prototyping work was called the DEC microserver, and then became future generations of these network servers came from that initial prototyping system.
And you said the management in the US weren't interested in this?
They didn't feel like funding it, I think is what I meant. But I was a development engineer at the time. I hadn't, let's say, progressed to a design engineer at the time, but I was given a lot of responsibility to help get with the team, but to get that advanced prototype up and running before demonstrating it, which then allowed the funding to come in, and we were then able to build or productize the original product called the DEC microserver. That was
okay. And so how does that happen? I mean, what's the feeling like? You're kind of doing something that maybe isn't officially sanctioned, and who kind of said, let's go ahead with this anyway?
Well, we just decided, my management decided that we should do this anyway. It addressed the market need anyway, that we were there as a company or a group to do, and felt that they could afford, within the organisation of the Network and Communications Group, to go ahead and do something anyway as an advanced development, as opposed to starting straight into a very expensive, long-running project which then may have gone nowhere. So he did this advanced work to prove the concept, shall we say, which then got approved into a real product.
What was the reaction in the US? How did they kind of respond by the time you say, here's this thing, we've gone and done it anyway?
So I think the management came over to see the group, which, you know, we did travel back and forward. And basically they were shown this device in operation. And they asked what this was, and we said that's a project that we did to prove our point.
And what was their response?
And the response there, I think, was that they were very surprised that we'd managed to do this, and that it was doing what we said it would do. And from then we moved forward. What
happened to it next? So it became a product at this point?
This didn't. This was just an advanced development over a bigger board area. But the product then followed. So a 4-channel product called DEC Microserver was developed and became a backbone of, if you like, of the networking, wide area networking for DEC. And then following on from that, product became more advanced, higher performance, more channels, and more, if you like, flexible systems.
So it sounds like there was a great degree of freedom. You had freedom to operate, to follow kind of interests and pursuits at DEC.
Yeah, I think the culture allowed freedom of thought, flexibility in doing things, and if you made suggestions and proposals, you were listened to, and you could have a chance to actually explore them.
But it all sounds like it wasn't a massively hierarchical command and control structure, and that in some companies, if they told you no, that'd be the end of the matter.
I think there was a level of autonomy within the organisation to get things done. So, you know, the head of the networking group, if you like, organisation was in Marlborough in the US, and we were over in Reading in the UK. So there's sort of a natural disconnect that allows a certain level of freedom.
And what was it like? What was this like for you? Just because you're a fairly young engineer at this point, I take it. What's this kind of like for you working in this kind of environment?
Well, for me, I felt that I had a lot of latitude to do things, explore boundaries, go into areas that I hadn't necessarily expertise in, but which I was learning, and I was able to leverage that, if you like, and take advantage, and help me grow.
How do you think, was there any kind of areas you can think, this happened to me as a result of that, or any other product areas or personal areas where you think, yeah, because of that?
Well, I learned a lot about communications at the time, systems, and also how to test them and make those systems work, or make sure they were working, I should say, not make them work. But yeah, it enabled me to grow, you know, from a development engineer into design engineer, and then advance up through design, development, engineering roles over time.
And you came to be responsible for setting up a huge testing rig as well, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, so it was decided that a system testing group was necessary to, if you like, more formally test, more thoroughly test these servers, A, before they hit the field, and B, when they're in the field, you know, deployed at customers, if updates were needing to be done, which they did, either new product capabilities or fixing some issues, it wasn't unusual that you would make a fix in one area of the product and a related but not directly connected area, there would be an issue arise, and that would cause issues. And as I mentioned, these systems were going into banking systems and so on, and they really had to have reliability and good uptime. So my task, or the system testing group which I was leading, was to build up a testing environment where we could test everything that those systems were doing. So we built up a very complicated system testing in a network group, system testing group networking environment, that allowed us to connect lots of different servers and computer systems together and demonstrate and prove that when they made a change to the firmware, or it was normally firmware or software in the system that needed changing to fix an issue, that it hadn't broken anything else, and of course that the change actually did what it was intended to do.
Any way of kind of, I suppose, quantifying the size of the complexity of this kind of rig, this setup?
I think we wound up with a few racks, 19-inch racks, in a lab in Deck Park, stuffed with servers and computers with communication cards in them, and then sort of developed over time complex networking so that we could exercise the different parts of networking capability.
So running different protocols, or what?
Yes.
What beyond there?
Yeah, the protocols. It basically end-to-end testing with, if you like, applications able to communicate whether it's going over an X25 network or SDLC, HDLC kind of connections. Also things like ARP, which is Address Resolution Protocol, and RARP, which is the Reverse Address Resolution Protocol. Those things were all tested out because they're all part of networking. If the address resolution fails, your net packets don't get to the right place, or your data doesn't get to the right place.
Was there nothing like this in place beforehand?
There was testing, but we put this together as a specific environment to exercise the limits, let's say, and to ensure that we had an environment that you could just start up, put a new software release into the system, start the testing running to test the specific area, and then extend it to test everything else, so that we knew that nothing else had broken.
And do you, again, this is kind of interesting reflection on this DEC culture of kind of innovation. Do you think this is the DEC kind of culture of the engineering-led culture permitted this kind of innovation to take place?
I think so, because I was a development engineer at the time. I had a fair amount of autonomy to get things done, but that went all the way up, right? So the design engineers and seniors and so on and so forth, they had a lot of autonomy to make things happen. We would recruit people into the teams. We didn't just have people in Deck Park, for example, when we got together, but we didn't just people have in Reading. We had people in parts of the organisation outside, and we worked with Clonmel in Ireland, for example, for manufacturing. So it was. But I'm trying to think of in terms of the autonomy. I mean, basically the management in DEC in this group would decide we need to get this group or organisation to help us with this, and they connected all together.
So do you think at this point you're going to get more of a sense of DEC? Because I think when you were at CSS, you said it was very much just there. But at this point, you're getting a sense of the larger company?
Yes, a sense of the larger company, and also got to go to the US several times because of it. Because our headquarters of the group was in the US. We were doing these particular kinds of products, but there were other groups doing communications.
Where did you go to in the US?
Typically it was Marlborough in Massachusetts. I'd go to Maynard. I'd go to Nashua in New Hampshire. So those are the main places I would go. I actually loved going to the US when I came back, because you could take the helicopter from Maynard or Marlborough and fly into the airport to get your plane home.
What was I've heard about the DEC helicopter fleet. Tell us about it.
It was, I think it was recognised as one of the largest private helicopter fleets in the world at one point. And it was an interesting thing they did, was that they ran a service flying between the relevant various sites within Massachusetts, New Hampshire and so on. And you could book a seat and you didn't have to pay for it. If you didn't show up, your cost centre got charged. So they're going to run it anyway, and they only charge the cost centre if you didn't show up. And the other thing is you couldn't arrive in Logan and then get the helicopter out, because there's no guarantee you're going to arrive on time. But you could take the flight. So that saved driving down into the middle of Boston and then get to Logan on a Friday night, which is a nightmare. Much easier to just hop on a helicopter.
And this is incredible. How do you feel about DEC at this point? I mean, you've gone from not knowing much about it to being immersed in the culture, and you're flying helicopters with this company. How are you feeling about it?
I'm feeling that it's great. As I say, I mean, the company made a lot of things happen, made things available. And it was very interesting working with these people and going out to Maynard, for example, to the mill at Maynard, and talking to people there who've been immersed in DEC for many, many years, and I'm new. It was always very interesting talking to them, and they were always very helpful. You come up with an idea and they say, that's not going to work. Well, okay. And then they give you ideas about how it might work. So it was interesting that you would get, again, you had a chance to go and try things, and you would get help.
And your perception of the company, so are you seeing more of the culture at this point as well? Again, you're getting a feel, we hear a lot about the kind of the culture is very open, egalitarian. Are you seeing any of this in action,
Well, I think so. I mean, one of the things that happened for me was, I mentioned I didn't get a degree at that time, but I decided that actually it would be quite a good thing to do. So I decided to join the Open University, and I did a degree in mathematics and technology. And when I told my management that I was going to do this, they funded it. So, and I think because I was doing that, it helped in terms of my promotion steps, because if I just went in as a development engineer and didn't try to improve, that's one thing. If you go in as a development engineer and try to improve by, well, actually it'd be quite useful to get a degree in this area, it helps them to say, right, there's something here.
So they funded your Open University course. Any idea how much that was for them at that time?
No.
And it was what, a 3-year course or how?
Actually, we had, in this course of this, I got married and we had 3 children in 3 years. We moved house 6 times or more, including going to Scotland and back. So it took me 6 years. But it was up at 5:30 in the morning, because in those days, it was Open University programs were transmitted at ridiculous o'clock. So I converted a coal shed into my study.
Tell us about the management then. So were they always eager to push you on to kind of promote, for you to either improve yourself or to help you improve for the company?
Yes, I mean, the company, I think their attitude to appraisals was very good, in that they would definitely, and I had some particular managers that I'm still, if you like, very impressed with, about the way they would talk to you about what you've been doing in the last year, for example, or 6 months, whatever the review cycle was. And then encourage you in terms of, well, that's great, but and give ideas about, what else could you be doing, or what behaviour changes might be useful. I was always told I was one never to suffer fools gladly, so that came up every year. But I did improve. But anyway, they would give constructive advice on what you might do going forwards. And certainly, I mean, when I left DEC in the end, I was a sort of principal engineer, as having started as a development engineer. So I got through various levels.
So they're kind of promoting or pushing you to different posts within the company, or just acquiring different skills? How did it kind of work?
Both, really. I mean, there was the skills. The post was basically just going, you're doing a design job, and you're doing a good job, and then they promote you to a senior designer and principal engineer and so on and so forth. So some of it was a lot of that was all within the same organisation, and it was just steps, if you like, up. But pushing in terms of development of skills, they did that. And I loved it in the network and communications group, which begs the question why I went to Scotland, but we'll come to that.
Well, I was coming to that. So you're very comfortable in network communications group, and they're kind of flying you, they're going out to the States with the company, and you're on the private helicopter fleet up there, and then you go to Scotland. What took you to Scotland?
Okay, so I saw a new role arise in Scotland in a different area. I'd been doing communications for, 8 years. And I thought it's time to look and see what else there is. And DEC being a computer company, I thought, what else is there? And then a role arose up in Scotland in DEC in Air. Now, at that time, the Microvax 2 based single user graphics type computer system had arrived. The role in Scotland was to take that Microvax 2 and turn it into a multi-user server.
What does that mean?
Instead of having a single user with a single terminal working on that computer, you would have terminals that networked into it. So that might be with the communications like the ones I talked about, like the DHV11 and similar. But actually, that was one of the things we did in Scotland, was to create new communications devices to go inside this multi-user server. Because when it was being a single-user system, it didn't really need all of this. But in a multi-user server, it needed to have some different features. And that's what the DEC in Air role was. So that was the Microvax 3100 LAR, codename Waverley at the time. For obvious reasons, I guess. Waverley steamship. So I went up and I thought this could be interesting because it's a different field. It's in DEC. It's more computing based than networking based for the role. So I went to talk to the guys up there and took a role up there. Unfortunately, after about 2 years, I decided that for various reasons I needed to come back south.
So what would describe, because we talk about a lot about Reading and the southeast, it seems to be a lot of people have this conversation. We're kind of less aware of the other parts of the country. So what is the facility? What does it look like in Air? Is it like a manufacturing plant,
Yes.
an office?
Yes, it's a manufacturing site where they shoehorned into one corner a development centre, a design centre. So that was also quite small. I mean, it was about, I don't know, a dozen people maybe. And the idea, as I say, was to take a single user Microvax 2 and turn it into a multi-user system and add the features that make it a multi-user system.
Is it like an industrial park you're on up there? What's the bit? Is it
It
a modern building?
was a big building. I don't think it was actually a park because I think the only building there was DEC. But it was a big manufacturing site. Manufacturing sites I got involved with was DEC in Air, DEC in Clonmel in Ireland, and DEC in Galway. So those are the 3 sites in Great Britain and Ireland that I got involved with.
And how were you getting involved with them? What was your role with all of
Well, Air I got involved with initially only because I went up there to be part of the development team up there. Clonmel was that because that's where we put the DHV11 and DHU11 devices to be manufactured. And then Galway because they shut down Clonmel and a lot of people went from Clonmel to Galway before they shut down Galway.
What was communications like? Because you're dealing with a lot of distributed people, aren't you? And email, I imagine, was quite in its infancy at this point, or was that?
We had good email connections, actually, for these projects. I'd go to Ireland, I don't know, 6 times a year probably, when I was going out to the manufacturing. But no, I think we had pretty good telephone and email communications at that time.
Okay, so you're up in Air, and you were there for how long? Did you say?
2 years.
2 years, and then you decide. So, and how did that project work out? How did you develop the multi-user capacity?
Yeah, part of the team doing that, and my background being networking, it was sort of a bit biased towards the networking side. But yes, that seemed to be going well. Multi-user Microvax system, Microvax 2 system. But after 2 years or 18 months or so, I could see the writing on the wall, shall we say.
What happens?
Well, I don't know what happened exactly. 2 things happened, but detail's difficult. But 2 things happened. One, with family stuff, my wife and I decided it would be quite good to come back south. And that came about partly because I had realised that it looked like they were removing some of the responsibility from Air and taking it back to Maynard. So I had a hunch that the development group in Air, as opposed to the manufacturing site in Air, had a limited life. The result of that was I decided we would move back down south. Now, I didn't expect to move back down south to DEC, but I did, and that happened because I happened to have a technical problem, and I was chatting to one of my friends, ex-colleagues in Reading, about this technical problem because it was common to us. And I mentioned I had itchy feet and I needed to move. And out of that conversation, I got a job as a project leader back down in Reading.
You thought your time with DEC was done? Was it just because, why for what reasons did you think?
I wouldn't have left DEC if I could find a job. It's just I didn't expect to find a job necessarily back in the same group as I'd come from. So I hadn't even started looking at this point. Right? I decided I think there's a limited life for the group and there's family reasons why I need to be back south. I need to go looking for a job. I just so happened to have a discussion who then told the other chap I spoke to, told the person who recruited me that I was probably going to need a new job, and I've got a phone call. So that's how that came about.
And what was the job you ended up getting back in Reading?
So I was a project leader for a fibre optic accelerator device to go into a communication server.
Did they create the role for you, or was it?
No, it was there, and they wanted this device created, but they didn't have a project leader for it. So they wanted a principal engineer, design engineer, project leader to run this particular device, and that's what I did. And then I had people for that project. I had people in Reading and in Ireland working on that project, and that was a great project with people going back and forward and meeting up, and I just remember that project as being something that, again, given a lot of autonomy to just go and get the right people and make things happen.
How do you feel about the company? Because at this point they've taken you and your family up to Scotland, haven't they? And now they're going to bring you all back down again. How does this make you feel about the employers? These are kind of things in today's environment with employers. This is very not so much a common thing, is it?
Well, they didn't ask me to go to Scotland. I decided to go to Scotland, and then I decided that it was time to come back. The relocation package was quite good as well, but it's by the by. But no, it wasn't that they wanted me to go somewhere. Having said that, when I arrived in Scotland, I hadn't unpacked the boxes, and my manager, I walk into the office on the first morning, and my manager says, "I need a chat." He says, "There's a position opened up that supports us, but in Maynard. Would you like to go?" I said, "I haven't unpacked the boxes yet." He said, "Well, don't bother." I said no. I decided the US wasn't for me and my family. So I stayed in Scotland instead.
So they were ready to send you over to the States?
They were ready to relocate me to the States because they needed somebody to do that role, and I hadn't actually started the role in Scotland, so they could find somebody else for that, and they thought I would be a good fit for the role in the States. I decided not to take it.
So the question is, so how do you feel about it? Because they obviously, you're taking the initiative to go to these places. They are going with that. The packages are being made available to you. Does this create foster some kind of close relationship between you and DEC, do you feel?
I feel, because there was no issue when I said to the people in Reading that I'm going to go and I've taken a new role up in Scotland. It was all support. It wasn't disappointment. Oh, that sounds like a good role. All right. And then the guys in Scotland who hadn't actually worked with me yet felt that it would be a good role to send me off to the US to do the role if I wanted it. But there was no level of coercion here. There was a pure, would you like to do this? And I did go away and think about it, and I decided, well, no, I'm not going to do that. But I think, in my opinion, it's these kinds of behaviours and the way they did things that makes for loyalty in the company. I didn't want to leave DEC when I left DEC, but I chose to in the end.
Okay. come on to that in a second. Tell me about the fibre job which you took back down here. You said it was an interesting area. What was a little bit? Tell us about that project.
Well, it was basically an hardware accelerator to interface through fibre optic device into this communication server. So, high performance. So we've gone beyond RS-42 and all those sorts of wired connections to fibre optic instead.
And this is large. This is a big, wide area network, very, very fast communications.
Fast communications, yes.
Yeah,
that's what it's for.
And is this for hooking up DEC kit to DEC kit, or we're talking now the building blocks of the internet at this point?
It's a building block. You don't have to connect it to a DEC computer. Providing whatever you're connecting it to follows the right protocols. And at the end of the day, they're all driven by standards. So as long as you comply with the standards, then it'll work.
DEC was quite active and it played quite a strong role in the early internet, didn't it?
Yes.
How much were you aware of what was going on and DEC's role in that construction of the early internet? And were you part of that?
Well, I wasn't apart from using it. But no, I was aware of DEC's role in the early days of internet.
So where would this fibre product have gone? Who would have used that?
Well, it was part of the, again, the DECNIS type products.
And getting used by banks and high-end institutions?
High-end networking.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, so we're coming, I suppose, looking at reflections on DEC at this point. You didn't want to leave DEC, but eventually you did. What were the circumstances? How did this come about?
Well, it came about, it was after I started up and got the system testing group running. And the reason I started up the system testing group was that we were reducing the hardware development group in Reading. And they needed a system testing to improve what went out in the field. And I was working with various people, working on a hardware project, and then some of the team would be taken away because DEC wouldn't run another RIF. They went through quite a few reduction in forces. And I would keep losing people, which made obviously more challenging to get the job done. I started the system testing group up, or was asked to get this system testing group up and running, which I did, and developed it into quite a big organisation, if you like, from nothing in a couple of years. And then they started taking people away again from various organisations. I thought, this is not so hot. It's something I need to look at. And at that point, I decided I would, next time a redundancy package came up, I would take it. This was in 94.
And you took that?
I did.
So how had the company changed, I suppose? Because you joined in, what was it?
About 79, 80.
79. It's still, the company's very much on the rise. By the mid-80s, it's the second largest computer company in the world, and now it's RIFs.
So I think DEC hit something like 130,000 people at its peak. And as you say, it was the second largest company. Towards the end, it was down at 80,000. And we got told that it was a 60,000 person company with 80,000 people. That sort of doesn't make you very happy. But that was just one comment in terms of, that obviously the company has a way to go to where it thinks it needs to be. And it was about then I decided that it was probably time to look for something else. And one of the examples I have is that I had wanted to buy a product from a company called QuickTurn to help us in developing hardware products, because it would emulate that hardware product. And QuickTurn, well, actually we evaluated Zycat, various companies. QuickTurn were the only people who could do the job. And when I came to leave DEC, I contacted QuickTurn and told them that they were the only people who were able to do the job I wanted them to do, but I wasn't allowed to buy the product. Can I come and work for you instead? And that's what happened.
So you moved on. You took the package and moved on.
I took a package, I moved on to QuickTurn.
So how did it become, was the culture change? Was this kind of like, I suppose, this very generous and family-orientated culture? Was it changing during this time? Did you notice?
I didn't see a big change in that respect, no. I think the point was I'd been in DEC 15 years by now. I was getting, if you like, annoyed about the way things were going in terms of the organisation. I just thought it's probably time for a change.
What was the annoying thing? I've heard there's other people have said this before. How was it becoming
Well,
annoying?
because they were removing people from teams. You know, there were all these rifts coming through. There'd be one here, and then 3 months later there'd be another one, and then you find this other group. You know, and an example is, I think there was this is probably heresy. I don't know how you want to anecdotal, but you know, the people in Clonmel were told they were shutting Clonmel, and if you want a job, you can go to Galway. And the question was, well, are they going to shut down Galway? And the answer was, oh no. And I think it was 1 or 2 years later they shut down Galway. So that would imply sort of a drop off in care in the community, DEC community, if you like.
And obviously you were outside of DEC by the time obviously the Compaq acquisition came along and then the HPE acquisition came along. How did you feel looking at? Did you see it coming, looking outside of it, or even from this 94 era?
I didn't really, but then I wasn't really looking at that kind of aspect of things. I was surprised, but yeah, I was surprised, but I hadn't looked to see that would happen. So,
did you notice it when the two acquisitions went through? Where were you? Do you remember?
Well, I was working for QuickTurn, and then Cadence, because QuickTurn merged with Cadence. But physically where I was, I have no idea.
Did you notice the headlines or anything?
Oh, I will have done, but I can't remember now. I'm sure I would have seen that DEC is no longer DEC.
So just surprised?
I was just surprised that I thought the company, yes, it had been going through some times where they were doing these reduction in forces and changing within the company, but I expected that would settle down, stabilise, and then they would be able to continue as they were, but that didn't happen.
So just briefly before we get on to, I suppose, reflections, I was interested in the relationship between the UK and the US. Obviously, you had a lot of communications with the US and internationally as well. I was kind of curious, what was the relationship between UK and US from your perspective? Was it very collegiate? Was there a kind of a hierarchy of structure? It seems like they're very open to your ideas. And how would you describe the relationship between the two organisations from your perspective?
It's a difficult one. I think nobody ever put barriers up. Right? It was always, if you like, collaborative. You could talk to anybody, and you could have a good exchange of ideas. Some might be very frank, but you can have a good exchange of ideas, and then get on with what needed to be gone with.
And did you ever make it down to DEC Park? You were working at CSS before it was constructed. Did you ever check out?
So CSS was Arkwright Road. The network and communication started in Acre Road and then moved into DEC Park. And we were in DEC Park. We was only in Acre Road for a short time, relatively, because DEC Park was being constructed. And then we moved into DEC Park.
And what's DEC Park like?
I love DEC Park. I mean, it's Ken Nelson didn't like the triangular roofs, but anyway, DEC Park was a nice place to work, and it was a whole village. I mean, it had a bank, it had a travel agency, it had a good restaurant, and I just liked it. And also, it widened the scope of who you could talk to in DEC, because it wasn't just network and communications people; it was everybody, right? So there was sales, there was all the other organisations within a company that make a company work. And you could see any of those people.
Did that help you in terms of your roles, having that ability to talk to different people?
I guess it gave me a different perspective on certain things. Like, for example, one of my managers, bearing in mind very, very technical role, he then went off into sales and became a very successful salesperson, having started off as a very technical person. So, whether that was because we were in DEC Park and he got exposure, I don't know, but that was something he wanted to do. He was, in my opinion, he was one of my best managers in my entire career. So.
Right, and do you think DEC Park, so anything particularly, everyone mentions the road and the green carpet.
Yeah. And beside that green carpet was a massive lab, which is where I spent most of my time when I wasn't in my office, which was a cubicle. But there was a big lab that we would do our development work in and testing work in. That was right alongside the green road.
Was it a busy environment? Lots of people milling around?
There were quite a few people milling around. At times it looked empty, but other times it could be very busy.
And how was it a very modern looking building? But I hear about the pyramids. What was it kind of like, the feeling like inside of it?
It was nice. I mean, the building was clean, it was regular, it was well constructed, as I recall. It had to have this array of pyramids on the roof, which was a bit of a bone of contention, it seems. But no, it was a nice place to work, to be honest.
How did it compare to the old building, the old offices?
Well, far more modern. I mean, those were converted warehouses with cooling, heating trunking running through the middle of the ceiling and things like that. So, very different environment.
Do you ever go back down there to the site to Reading or to
No, not really.
Never curious to go down there?
Well, I pass it occasionally, but I mean, it's not there now, so I don't dwell on it. Let's say.
No feeling, no pangs, or
no, not really. I mean, time moves on. So no, I mean, I rarely go down that piece of road anyway. I mean, nowadays I have definitely no need to go down that piece of road anyway, so I don't bother.
Tell me, so wrapping up, think a little bit about, we asked this question at the start, what do you think, two questions really, DEC's legacy on you, and you mentioned one manager that affected you, it sounds like quite a lot. If you could maybe talk about how did DEC influence you as an individual, either personally or for your work culture, then what do you think DEC's legacy is to the world, given it was such a large force in computing, but now no longer exists?
Yeah. So, personally, I think working with specific managers, there was more than one good manager that I enjoyed working for, but there's one in particular. The team of people, or teams of people that I worked with, they were all... I can't think of anyone in any of the teams I worked with that I didn't get on with or enjoy company and things like that, and work closely and well with. So I think it's interesting to have an environment where people can work in that way, collaboratively and enjoyably, and get the job done. So that, I think, stood me in good stead going forwards in terms of thinking about how I would work in my next role. In terms of legacy, well, DEC computers, the Microvacs, the VAX 11780, 90, all of that range, and then there was the Alpha processor that came about. I worked with some of the team that worked on that as well, and so on. So that was, they had great computing products. There were some missteps along the way, like PCs, for example. I think Ken Elson's famously said something like, nobody would need a PC, a computer at home, they just use my mainframes. But then they came out with some OEM equipment. But I think hard to say on the impact, the legacy that they made overall. I mean, I think just being there with a very good compute system like the VAXes and so on, as opposed to just IBMs and Genrad and all those various different organisations or companies with computing systems. I think DEC was very interesting, and I guess I don't know. I'll be interested to know, because I don't know what influence the acquisition or conversion DEC into Compaq and then HP, what that influence was. And I haven't spoken to anybody about that. So.
Do you think it sounds like the DEC culture has affected you? Obviously, clearly, you took it with you into other places you worked. If you think about DEC as either technology products or the culture, do you think that's been translated into the world around us? We hear technology, maybe cloud computing, but not necessarily that. But is there anything it leaves behind us, if nothing else, good memories?
I think a lot of thought in computing systems and so on following DEC were influenced by DEC. So.